Russian Civil War. The Russian Empire collapsed like a house built on sand, and from its ruins emerged the bloodiest civil war in European history. The Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917 overthrew the provisional government, but seizing power and holding it proved to be vastly different challenges. Vladimir Lenin's Red Army faced a coalition of enemies known collectively as the White Army, monarchists, liberals, and military officers united only by their hatred of Bolshevism. Between them stood the Green Armies, peasant militias fighting for local autonomy against all centralized authority. The war consumed Russia like a fever. Entire regions became battlegrounds where brother fought brother and neighbor denounced neighbor. The Red Terror and White Terror competed in brutality, with mass executions, torture, and political purges becoming routine instruments of policy. Cities starved as agricultural production collapsed. The railway system, vital to a nation spanning 11 time zones, disintegrated under constant warfare. Typhus and cholera swept through populations weakened by malnutrition. The fighting raged from the frozen tundra of Siberia to the deserts of Central Asia, involving foreign intervention from a dozen nations who saw an opportunity to reshape Russia's future. When the guns finally fell silent in 1923, the Bolsheviks had won, but the victory was written in unfathomable suffering. Between 7 and 12 million people had died, most of them civilians claimed by disease, starvation, and political violence. The Russian Civil War didn't just change a government, it created a new civilization built on the ruins of the old. The Soviet Union that emerged was forged in paranoia and blood, a state where political violence had become normalized, where the Tsar's secret police were replaced by something far more efficient and ruthless. The Civil War's legacy of internal enemies and ideological purity would haunt Soviet society for 7 decades, proving that the deepest wounds are the ones a nation inflicts upon itself. Spanish Civil War. Spain, in 1936, was a nation fracturing along every conceivable fault line: rich versus poor, church versus state, centralized power versus regional autonomy, tradition versus modernity. When a military coup led by General Francisco Franco attempted to overthrow the democratically elected Republican government in July 1936, the country split cleanly in two. But this was more than a Spanish conflict. It became a rehearsal for World War II, a proving ground where fascism and democracy would test their strength before the world stage. The Republicans held the major cities and industrial centers, supported by workers' militias, anarchists, and international volunteers who saw the fight as a last stand against fascism's spread across Europe. The nationalists controlled the rural, conservative heartland, backed by the Catholic Church, landowners, and crucially, military aid from Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy. German Condor Legion bombers practiced the terror tactics they would later use across Europe, reducing the Basque town of Guernica to rubble in an afternoon, creating Picasso's most famous painting and a new vocabulary for civilian suffering. The war was savage beyond measure. In nationalist zones, suspected Republicans were lined up and shot in their thousands. In Republican areas, churches burned and priests were executed. As the conflict dragged on, the Republic fractured from within, with communists, anarchists, and socialists turning on each other even as Franco's forces tightened the noose. By 1939, Franco's victory was complete. Nearly 500,000 people had died, and hundreds of thousands fled into exile, never to return. Franco's dictatorship would last until his death in 1975, making the Spanish Civil War's aftermath one of Europe's longest. The conflict proved that democracy could be destroyed from within, that international support matters in civil wars, and that the hatreds forged in fratricidal conflict can poison a society for generations. Spain's Pact of Forgetting after Franco's death was an attempt to move forward without accountability, leaving wounds that still haven't fully healed. Yugoslav Wars. Yugoslavia was an impossible creation. 6 republics, 5 nations, 4 languages, 3 religions, bound together by an idea and an iron-fisted leader. When Marshal Tito died in 1980, the glue that held the federation together began to dissolve. By 1991, the country was tearing itself apart. Slovenia and Croatia declared independence, and the Yugoslav People's Army, dominated by Serbian officers, moved to prevent the dissolution. What followed was the worst violence on European soil since World War II, a decade of ethnic cleansing, siege warfare, and atrocities that shocked the world's conscience. The siege of Sarajevo lasted 1,425 days, the longest siege of a capital city in modern warfare. civilians were targeted by snipers as they crossed streets or waited in bread lines. In Bosnia, neighbor turned against neighbor based on religious identity that had been largely irrelevant for decades. The term ethnic cleansing entered the global vocabulary as systematic campaigns of murder and forced deportation emptied entire regions of their historic populations. Rape became a weapon of war, employed systematically to terrorize communities and break social bonds. The war reached its moral nadir in July 1995 when Bosnian Serb forces overran the UN-designated safe area of Srebrenica. Over the course of several days, they systematically murdered more than 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys, the worst mass killing in Europe since the Holocaust. Dutch UN peacekeepers, outgunned and abandoned by their leadership, could only watch. The massacre galvanized international intervention, leading to NATO airstrikes and eventually the Dayton Accords that ended the Bosnian War. The Yugoslav Wars left approximately 140,000 dead and 4 million displaced, carving one nation into 7. War crimes trials continued decades later, with perpetrators still being discovered living quiet lives in European suburbs. The wars proved that Europe had not evolved beyond ethnic hatred, that genocide could happen again on European soil, and that ancient grievances could be weaponized by cynical leaders. The Balkans remain fragile, a reminder that civil wars never truly end, they just pause. English Civil War. King Charles I believed in the divine right of kings with the fervor of a true believer. Parliament believed in its ancient liberties with equal conviction. When these two immovable forces collided in 1642, England descended into a war that would transform not just a kingdom, but the very concept of political authority in the Western world. The country split between royalists who rallied to the king's standard and parliamentarians who took up arms in the name of English liberties and Protestant faith. The war consumed England, Scotland, and Ireland in a vortex of violence that contemporaries called simply the Great Rebellion. Families divided, father against son, brother against brother. The royalist cavalry led by Prince Rupert was initially dominant, but Parliament had the wealth of London and the crucial ports. As the war dragged on, a new kind of army emerged under Oliver Cromwell, the New Model Army, a professional fighting force based on merit rather than aristocratic rank, religious in fervor, and ruthlessly efficient in battle. The war's turning point came at Naseby in 1645, where Cromwell's forces shattered the royalist army. Charles was captured, escaped, and plunged the nation into a second civil war. This time, Parliament's patience was exhausted. In an event that shocked Europe, Charles III was put on trial for treason against his own people. On January 30th, 1649, the king was beheaded outside his own palace. The divine right of kings died with him on that scaffold. The Civil War and its aftermath cost approximately 200,000 lives in a population of just 5 million, a catastrophic proportion. England became a republic, the Commonwealth, though it would last only until 1660. But the ideas unleashed, that kings could be held accountable, that government required the consent of the governed, that parliament was sovereign, these would reshape the political landscape of the modern world. The English Civil War proved that no authority, however ancient or divinely sanctioned, was beyond challenge. Finnish Civil War. Finland's independence from Russia in December 1917 should have been a moment of pure joy for a nation that had waited centuries for sovereignty. Instead, within months, the new nation tore itself apart in one of the most brutal civil wars in European history. The country split between the Reds, industrial workers, and landless peasants inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution next door, and the Whites, landowners, middle class, and those who feared Finland would become a Soviet satellite. The war erupted in January 1918 with coordinated uprisings in southern industrial cities. The Reds, supported by Russian Bolsheviks and armed Finnish Red Guards, quickly seized Helsinki and much of the south. The Whites, led by General Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim, a former Imperial Russian officer, organized in the north and center. What followed was a war of extraordinary savagery considering its brevity. In just 108 days, approximately 37,000 people died in a nation of only 3 million, a rate of killing that exceeded even the Western Front of World War I. The White Victory in May 1918 was followed by something even more terrible, a White Terror that dwarfed the Red Terror that had preceded it. Suspected Reds were rounded up by the tens of thousands and placed in concentration camps where starvation and disease killed more than any battle. Summary executions were commonplace. In the city of Viborg, hundreds of prisoners were loaded onto barges and drowned in the Gulf of Finland. The camps didn't close until late 1918, by which time 13,000 people had died in them, far more than had fallen in combat. The Finnish Civil War left psychological scars that took generations to heal. Families were divided, with some members having fought on opposite sides. The word red became a political curse, and class divisions hardened into concrete. Yet Finland survived, maintained its independence, and eventually built one of the world's most successful social democracies. The Civil War remained a taboo subject for decades, discussed only in whispers. It proved that even small nations can tear themselves apart with devastating efficiency, and that the hardest battles to win are the ones fought against your own people. Greek Civil War. Greece emerged from World War II devastated by occupation and resistance warfare, but the guns had barely cooled before Greeks turned them on each other. The civil war that erupted was the first hot conflict of the Cold War, a proxy battle between communism and the Western democracies, fought on Greek soil with Greek blood. The Communist Democratic Army of Greece, battle-hardened from fighting Nazis, faced government forces backed by British and then American military aid and advisors. The war was fought in the mountains and villages of rural Greece, far from Athens' gaze. Communist guerrillas controlled entire regions, establishing parallel governments and recruiting from populations exhausted by war but hopeful for radical change. The government forces, purged and rebuilt by foreign advisors, fought back with increasing effectiveness. Both sides committed atrocities that darkened Greece's ancient soil. Villages suspected of harboring guerrillas were burned. Civilians caught between the armies faced impossible choices: support one side and risk execution by the other. The conflict took a decisive turn when Yugoslavia's Tito broke with Stalin in 1948 and closed the border, cutting off crucial supply lines and sanctuary for the Greek communists. American military aid poured in through the Truman Doctrine, the first major commitment of U.S. power to containing communist expansion. The Democratic Army launched desperate offensives but was ground down by superior firepower and numbers. By October 1949, the last guerrilla bands had been defeated or fled across the border. The human cost was staggering for a small nation, approximately 160,000 dead and nearly 700,000 displaced. Thousands of children were evacuated by the communists to Eastern Bloc countries, creating a diaspora of displaced Greeks. The victorious government established a repressive state apparatus that would culminate in the military dictatorship of 1967-1974. The Greek Civil War proved that the Cold War would be fought in hot battles on the periphery, that superpowers would fund proxy wars rather than face each other directly, and that the ideological struggle between capitalism and communism would extract its highest price from small nations caught in the middle. Irish Civil War. The Irish Civil War was born from victory's bitter compromise. After centuries of British rule and a brutal war of independence, Ireland had won its freedom, but the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921 granted not a republic but a free state with dominion status, still tied to the British crown. More painfully, it partitioned Ireland, leaving 6 northern counties under British control. The Irish Republican Army, which had fought together against the British, split over whether to accept the treaty. Former comrades, men who had fought side by side in ambushes and raids, now prepared to kill each other over the question of principle versus pragmatic compromise. The pro-treaty forces, led by Michael Collins and supported by the new Irish Free State government, faced anti-treaty Republicans under Eamon de Valera, who saw acceptance of anything less than a full republic as betrayal. The war began in June 1922 when Free State forces bombarded the Four Courts in Dublin, where anti-treaty forces had established their headquarters. What followed was an irregular conflict more bitter than the fight against Britain had been, precisely because the stakes were so personal. Collins, the charismatic leader of the independence struggle, was killed in an ambush in August 1922, shot by former allies who knew his tactics because they had once shared them. The Free State government, desperate to establish control, adopted policies of harsh repression, executing 77 anti-treaty prisoners without trial, far more than the British had executed during the War of Independence. Anti-treaty forces responded with assassination and sabotage, but they were slowly ground down by superior numbers and resources. The war ended in May 1923 with a ceasefire, not a treaty, no formal surrender, no reconciliation, just an exhausted silence. Approximately 2,000 had died, but the real casualty was Irish unity. The Civil War's divisions dominated Irish politics for generations, with the two major parties, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, inheriting their rivalry directly from opposite sides of the conflict. Families were split, with some members not speaking for decades. The Irish Civil War proved that the most vicious conflicts are those fought over nuances of principle, and that the hardest enemies to forgive are the ones who were once your brothers in arms. Ukrainian Civil War. As the Russian Empire disintegrated, Ukraine saw its chance for independence after centuries of subjugation, but the Ukrainian People's Republic, declared in 1917, was born into chaos. Within its borders and on its periphery, at least 6 different armies fought for control: Ukrainian nationalists, Bolshevik Reds, anti-Bolshevik Whites, Polish forces, anarchist bands under Nestor Makhno, and German occupiers. The result was a maelstrom of violence that turned Ukraine into one of the bloodiest battlegrounds of the early 20th century. The conflict was nightmarishly complex. Alliances shifted like sand. Today's ally was tomorrow's enemy. The Ukrainian government, led by Simon Petliura, struggled to maintain authority even in the capital. Bolshevik forces invaded repeatedly, establishing and then losing control of major cities. The White Army under Denikin fought both Reds and Ukrainian nationalists. Polish forces intervened, seeking to expand Poland's eastern border. Anarchist peasant armies controlled entire regions, answering to no central authority. Amid this chaos, a horrific wave of pogroms swept across Ukraine. Jewish communities, historically significant in Ukrainian cities and shtetls, became targets for all factions. Nationalist forces, whites, reds, and independent bands all participated in mass killings. Between 50,000 and 200,000 Jews were murdered in what became a preview of the Holocaust's horrors. Entire communities were wiped out, survivors left to wander devastated landscapes. By 1921, the Bolsheviks had prevailed, and Ukraine was absorbed into the Soviet Union. The brief independence was extinguished, not to return for 7 decades. An estimated 1.5 million people died in the conflict and its associated famines and epidemics. The Ukrainian Civil War demonstrated how the collapse of empire creates power vacuums that multiple forces rush to fill, how nationalist aspirations can be crushed between greater powers, and how civilian populations become targets when authority fragments. The dream of Ukrainian independence was buried, but not forgotten, waiting beneath Soviet rule for its chance to resurface. War of the Roses. Medieval England's great noble houses had grown powerful and restless during the long, disastrous 100 Years' War with France. When that conflict ended in defeat, hardened soldiers returned to an England ruled by a weak king, Henry VI, whose periodic descents into madness created a power vacuum. 2 branches of the Plantagenet dynasty, the House of Lancaster represented by a red rose and the House of York bearing a white rose, both claimed superior right to the throne. What began as aristocratic rivalry in 1455 escalated into 3 decades of intermittent civil war that would destroy the medieval English nobility and transform the monarchy. The war was fought not with mass armies, but through a series of bloody battles where England's great lords brought their retinues to settle dynastic questions with sword and bow. At the Battle of Towton in 1461, fought in a blinding snowstorm, an estimated 28,000 men died in a single day, the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. The snow was said to have turned red for miles. Loyalties shifted with each victory. Great families rose and fell with each changing fortune. Being on the losing side in one battle could mean execution and the extinction of your lineage. The conflict reached its crescendo in 1485 at Bosworth Field, where Henry Tudor, a distant claimant with tenuous connections to the Lancastrian cause, faced King Richard III. Richard's death in battle, his crown famously rolling into a thorn bush where it was retrieved and placed on Henry's head, ended the Plantagenet dynasty that had ruled England for over 300 years. Henry VII, uniting the red and white roses through marriage, founded the Tudor dynasty. The Wars of the Roses killed approximately half of England's titled nobility. Ancient families that had ruled estates since the Norman conquest were wiped out. The feudal system of powerful lords with private armies was broken, allowing the Tudors to centralize royal power. The war proved that dynastic conflicts could consume entire aristocracies, and that from the ashes of such destruction, new forms of government could emerge. Medieval England died in those battles, and the seeds of the modern English state were planted in its grave. French Wars of Religion. France in the 16th century was being torn apart by a question that had already bathed much of Europe in blood. Could Catholics and Protestants coexist in a single kingdom? The Huguenots, French Calvinists, had grown numerous and powerful, counting among their ranks significant portions of the nobility. The ultra-Catholic faction, led by the powerful Guise family, saw Protestant growth as both heresy and a threat to the social order. Caught between these irreconcilable forces, the French crown oscillated between tolerance and persecution, satisfying no one and inflaming both sides. The conflict erupted into open warfare in 1562, beginning a cycle of battles, massacres, and uneasy truces that would last over 3 decades. The violence reached its horrific peak on St. Bartholomew's Day, August 24, 1572. What began as the assassination of Huguenot leaders in Paris exploded into a general massacre. Catholic mobs, with the tacit approval of the crown, hunted Huguenots through the streets. The Seine ran red with blood. The killings spread to other cities across France. In 2 months, between 5,000 and 30,000 Huguenots were slaughtered. The wars dragged on, devastating the French countryside and economy. Armies, whether nominally Catholic or Protestant, pillaged without discrimination. Entire regions were depopulated. Agriculture collapsed in many areas. The French crown, weakened and impoverished, lost control of significant portions of the kingdom. The conflict became increasingly about political power rather than religious conviction, with Catholic Spain and Protestant England both intervening to advance their interests. The wars finally ended in 1598 when Henry IV, a Protestant who had converted to Catholicism to secure the throne, famously saying Paris is worth a mass, issued the Edict of Nantes. This granted limited toleration to Huguenots, allowing France to finally achieve peace after 36 years of intermittent civil war. Between 2 and 4 million people had died, about 10% of France's population. The French wars of religion proved that religious differences could fracture even the most centralized monarchies, that toleration was a necessary price for peace, and that civil wars fought over faith are the most difficult to end because compromise feels like betrayal of absolute truth. The Fronde. The Fronde was France's last great aristocratic rebellion, a convulsive attempt by the nobility to resist the centralizing power of the crown before absolute monarchy crushed them forever. The name comes from the slingshots Parisian children used, as if the great nobles were mere troublemakers, but this conflict nearly destroyed the French state at a moment when it was fighting enemies on all borders. The war had 2 phases, the Fronde of the Parlement and the Fronde of the Princes, but both were fundamentally about whether France would be ruled by a strong central authority or fragmented among powerful aristocratic factions. The rebellion began in Paris in 1648 when the Parlement of Paris, the kingdom's highest court, resisted new taxes imposed to fund France's involvement in the 30 Years' War. The regent, Anne of Austria, ruling for her young son Louis XIV, attempted to arrest the leading magistrates, and Paris erupted in revolt. Barricades went up overnight. The royal family was forced to flee the capital in humiliation. What started as a tax revolt evolved into a broader rebellion when great nobles saw an opportunity to reclaim powers lost to royal centralization. The conflict was marked by shifting alliances of bewildering complexity. Nobles switched sides multiple times, pursuing personal grievances and ambitions under the banner of constitutional principles. Prince Louis II de Condé, the kingdom's greatest general, fought first for the crown, then against it, then for it again. Paris was besieged and starved. Armies ravaged the countryside. The young king Louis XIV, forced to flee Paris and live in near poverty during the rebellion's height, never forgot the humiliation. The Fronde collapsed from internal contradictions in 1653. The nobles couldn't unite around any common program beyond opposition to royal authority. When Condé made the fatal error of allying with Spain, France's enemy, he lost whatever popular support the rebellion had enjoyed. Royal forces gradually restored control, and the leaders fled into exile or made peace. The immediate death toll was relatively modest, but the Fronde's impact was profound. It was the last time French nobles would openly resist the crown. When Louis XIV came of age, he built Versailles and forced the nobility to become courtiers rather than warriors. The Fronde proved that divided opposition cannot defeat centralized power, and that noble privilege was no match for royal absolutism backed by professional armies. Portuguese Civil War. Portugal's civil war was a family tragedy writ large, a conflict between two brothers over the soul of the nation. When King John VI died in 1826, his son Pedro was already Emperor of Brazil. Pedro issued a constitutional charter for Portugal and abdicated in favor of his 7-year-old daughter Maria, appointing his brother Miguel as regent. Miguel was to marry Maria when she came of age, uniting the family and the kingdom. Instead, Miguel seized the throne in 1828, abolishing the constitution and declaring himself absolute monarch. Portugal split between Miguelists, conservatives who supported absolute monarchy and the old order, and liberals who supported the constitutional system and the rightful Queen Maria. The conflict was complicated by European power politics. Absolutist powers like Austria supported Miguel. Britain and France, despite their own reservations about liberalism, supported the constitutional cause. Pedro, after abdicating the Brazilian throne, personally led a liberal expedition in 1832, landing in Portugal to fight for his daughter's crown against his own brother. The war became a struggle between two visions of Portugal's future: backward-looking absolutism or constitutional monarchy open to modern ideas. The siege of Porto lasted over a year, with liberal forces bottled up in the city while Miguelist armies controlled most of the country. Disease and starvation claimed thousands. Both sides committed atrocities, executing prisoners and persecuting civilians suspected of supporting the enemy. The naval battle of Cape St. Vincent in 1833 gave the liberals crucial control of the seas, allowing them to resupply Porto and eventually land forces near Lisbon. Miguel's defeat in 1834 ended not just the Civil War but the era of absolute monarchy in Portugal. Miguel went into exile, dying in Germany in 1866, never having reconciled with his brother or niece. The war cost approximately 7,000 battle deaths, but thousands more perished from disease and starvation. The Portuguese Civil War demonstrated that constitutional government was the future, even if it had to be imposed by force, that family bonds meant nothing when set against political principles, and that even small nations could become battlegrounds for larger European ideological conflicts. Portugal emerged from the war as a constitutional monarchy, though unstable and economically devastated, setting the stage for the republic that would replace it in 1910.